Okay, so welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to organize this fourth event in our series of interviews with leading sociologists and sociological theorists. And today it is a pleasure really to talk to Professor Avtar Brah, who is a theory of diaspora studies and has written extensively on migration, gender, and race, and has been also very much influenced by the work of Stuart Hall. So today we will be talking about her work and also work of Stuart Hall. And the idea behind these discussions is to sort of make sociological thinking accessible to the wider audience, to look at the biographical, social, political context of ideas, the way how they've developed over the years. And, what we want to do in a sense is to look at the kind of the key concepts and how thinking has been shaped over the years. Okay, so Steve, you can take over.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much, Siniša. Well, I'll talk a little bit about Stuart Hall, and then I'll just introduce a little bit about, talk a little bit about Avtar as well. Just to give a context of, Stuart Hall, some of his work before we have a more in-depth discussion. Stuart Hall was born in Kingston in Jamaica in 1932 into a middle-class family where issues of race and class intersected from the outset. Both parents, though middle class, came from different class formations. His father, from this is to quote Hall, from the coloured lower middle class background, while his mother from a more prosperous context, as he describes in his autobiography, was fair and in colour and saw herself as practically English. So in this context of class aspiration, Hall refers to them as being a lower middle class family that was trying to be a middle class Jamaican family, trying to be an upper middle class Jamaican family, trying to be an English Victorian family. And it's within this sort of context of a class conscious, colour conscious, hierarchical racial order in Jamaica that David Morley refers to it as a pigmentocracy, that Hall was born with dark skin, and he notes that his sister remarked when he was born that rather derogatorily, she remarked, "Who is this coolie baby?" And it was a very for Hall, it was a very repressive and stifling family and national context, and to try to escape it, he left to travel to England in 1951 as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, arriving there just 3 years after the Empire Windrush had arrived in 1948. Traveling on a train between Bristol and London, he remarked that he felt he knew the landscapes from reading Thomas Hardy's novels. And though he escaped in one sense from his family colonial context, in another he migrated from the periphery of the empire to one of its intellectual centres. And he refers to Oxford University, and this is a quote, as the motor that creates Englishness. So this sense of dislocation, of disidentification and in-betweenness pervades much of his life. And again, this is a quote from one of the many interviews that he carried out. "Having been prepared by colonial education, I knew England from the inside, but I'm not and never will be English. I know both places intimately, but I'm not wholly of either place. And that's exactly the diasporic experience. Far enough to experience the sense of exile and loss, close enough to understand the enigma of always postponed arrival." So in his time in England, he was profoundly shaped, politically at least, by two events, both of which took place in 1956. Firstly was the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and the second event was the Suez crisis. The first showed the persistent nature of Soviet authoritarianism, while the second demonstrated England's continuing policy of empire in its attempt to intervene when Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. He subsequently abandoned his PhD on Henry James, and together with Charles Taylor, Ralph Samuel, and Gabriel Pearson, he founded an independent socialist journal, Universities and Left Review, in 1957. This later merged with E.P. Thompson and John Savile's The New Reasoner to form New Left Review. And he's not recognized for this very important early work, but it was profound in shaping intellectual culture in England. In 1964, as well as publishing the popular arts, he became a research fellow at the Centre of Cultural Studies with Richard Hoggart, a graduate centre located in Birmingham University. He subsequently became director in 1968 and remained there until he left for the Open University in 1979. Now, although Hall's often seen as a founder of cultural studies and the CCS, I mean, these were probably more tied to Hoggart and Raymond Williams. His work, although it's often seen just in terms of cultural studies, was preoccupied with I think, with three other C's: the relationship between the conceptual and the concrete within the context of specific conjunctures, in order to try to understand how people could, how these conjunctures could help us animate or engender forms of political action. And Hall, for much of his life, worked, although he didn't produce many sole-authored books, he often worked with others. And this included his work at the Centre of Contemporary Studies, which were often collected volumes focusing on class, culture, race, ideology, youth, gender, and the media, as well as a number of other important issues. He's probably remembered from this period for writing the Policing the Crisis book and the Resistance Through Rituals book. And it's through in the Policing the Crisis book that he coins the term, which was later developed in the great moving right show, of Thatcherism and also authoritarian populism. As well as his important work for the Open University, which included writings on modernity, the state, representation, identity, culture, colonialism, post-colonial and globalization. In later life, he moved back into the arts, becoming chair of Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers, and as well as the International Institute of Visual Arts. In later life, increasing issues with his kidneys affected his health, and he died in February 2014. So that's just a very brief summary of Hall's sort of biographical context. And to discuss this, as Siniša has said, we have Avtar Brah here, and Avtar Brah has really interrogated Hall's work and extended it, as well as developing her own profound insights. So we're very happy to have Avtar join us. Avtar was formerly a professor of sociology at Birkbeck, and her books include Cartographies of Diaspora, as well as Contesting Identities, Hybridity and its Discontents, Thinking Identities, Racism, Ethnicity and Culture and Global Futures, Migration, Environment and Globalization, the latter edited with Mary Hickman and Martin McGoyle. Avtar was awarded a MB in 2001 in recognition of her research. So on that, I'll pass you over to Siniša will ask the first question.
Okay, so after again, we will ask you a few questions about Stuart Hall, and then we'll continue with your own work, which very much links with it. So Steve has already mentioned kind of some influences on Hall, particularly in British context, Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams, and he worked with him, and you work with Hall, and I mentioned with Hoggart as well. And then the continental influence, particularly Gramsci in early years and Althusser. And some of the concepts that we kind of know from Gramsci, like hegemony, have been developed further and expanded by Hall, and he developed his own, lots of own concepts: articulation, identity formation, overdetermination. So maybe you could reflect a little bit on these influences, on early influences on Hall.
Yes, definitely Hall was very strongly influenced by continental scholars, and particularly Gramsci, and Althusser and Gramsci influenced him greatly. And his important concept of hegemony, for instance, it occurs, he talks about hegemony occurring when a dominant class fraction extends its authority in production through to civil society and the state. And he brings together the notion of consent and coercion. So hegemony actually works with coercion and consent, although obviously in the societies in which we live in, capitalist societies, liberal societies, it's the sort of consent that is most dominant, really. We work through consent, very rarely through coercion. At least we try not to. And he then talks about articulation. Articulation, he brings together two notions of articulation. One is the notion of connect, which obviously articulation is about connecting dissimilar or even similar sort of, formations. But also he talks about connect and giving voice to. So when we say we are articulating something, we talk about giving voice to something. So he brings together these two notions of giving voice to and connecting in the notion of articulation. And he works through ideas about what's happening in society at that time. And did you want to ask me something else around that? His notion of conjuncture, of course, is important.
Sure, yeah, conjuncture.
Yeah, because that comes a lot in his work, and conjuncture is a historically specific moment in which sort of, there's a balance of forces and contradictions to which we have to attend. And in a sense, conjunctures give us the opportunity to intervene and to change and rearrange sort of the social kinds of arrangements in a new and different form.
Thanks very much. This is very good. Steve, you can. Yeah.
Thanks, Avtar. I mentioned in the overview that one of these major legacies is this work in developing cultural studies and looking at everyday cultures in a very fine-grained and critical way, which brings forward the idea of power. What do you think are the most important intellectual legacies of his understanding of culture and identity? I mean, these are some really core concepts in his work. What do you think what do you think is very useful and explanatory with these terms?
Well, I think culture is very important, obviously, because culture, he talks about culture as signifying practices, as meaning-making practices, as practices which are central to the way in which we live. We constitute our lives around cultures. And he talks about questions about culture and identity very centrally in his work. Identity, he thinks through notions of identification, which is identification with something that is similar, but also identification with something that is different. So questions of identification are very central to his work. And in that sense, he's talking about identity in relation to young people, for example, in relation to Black people, Asians, the arrival in Britain. In Placing the Crisis, he actually gives us a summary of the arrival in Britain of Asian and African Caribbean background peoples, how they came to actually be concentrated in what were sometimes derogatory called ghettos, but actually they were not ghettos in the negative sense because they were quite culturally thriving kind of places. And identity was central to the ways in which people who came from another place developed in a new context a sense of themselves, a sense through which they could project their cultures and their economic contributions and their political development.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Steve has already mentioned that Hall has much of his work really were essays, engaged essays, and he would rarely write books. And he often collaborated with many other people in Birmingham and in Open University. And one of the kind of early joint contributions is Policing the Crisis that Steve mentioned as well, which discusses race and class. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about this relationship, this kind of intersectional element of race and class, which he started, and your work also kind of continues with this, bringing gender as well and
Yes.
aspects. You know, like encoding, the coding model was also developed and then, you know, kind of used later.
Yes.
So all of these things are still very relevant, very much now.
Very relevant. I mean, I've been reading through some of his work recently, and it's quite amazing how relevant it is. Especially, I mean, Policing the Crisis was published in 1978, but it's still so very, very relevant to what's going on today. It's the ways in which, for example, crime in mugging he talked about in Policing the Crisis, which is actually at one level just a crime, but how it actually gets converted into a social crime, how it gets socially constructed into an index of social malaise, of social crisis. And he talks a great deal about the ways in which, obviously, there are what he calls the primary definers of this ways in which his theorization is taken forward. Within media, he talks about primary definers, because media plays a very central role in making notions of mugging popular in society. And he talks about media, the primary definers in the media, who were mainly, obviously, more powerful people rather than the kind of, you know, the subaltern groups, how these people influenced the ways in which society actually goes through these crises.
I was just thinking when you said, sorry, Steve, just you know, he obviously, you know, he couldn't anticipate the social media, but it's interesting, you know, how we have all of these concepts that can be used now and extended in the world that we live in a kind
Yes.
of digital age, and you know, especially in the context of race and class, and you know, I think just a small observation.
No, absolutely. I mean, race, for example. I mean, in a sense, we know that Marxism, classical Marxism, actually didn't engage with race. But in the work of Stuart Hall, he very much engages with class and race together. And class is obviously the motor engine of capitalist societies, but race is central to the ways in which class actually impacts on people. So he talks about young Black people, you know, that at one level they are a class fraction, but they're simultaneously racialized, and I would say gendered. And therefore, they are, in that crucial sense, articulating, these are that his word, articulation, the articulation of race with class, with gender, are important to the ways in which Hall actually tries to develop his analysis.
Thanks, that's great.
Hall was, you know, he was read very, very broadly and widely, and his later work seems to be quite heavily influenced by people like the Clown Move, the post-Marxism,
Yes, yes, yes.
and Foucault, but also post-structuralism. But his work also tends, although he doesn't leave these earlier works behind, he sort of shifts focus a little bit, if you like, and he starts to look at different issues, writing more on identity, positioning, globalization, diaspora, Black photography. And one of the major essays he talks about is the development of new forms of ethnicity. In this essay on new ethnicities. Could you say a little bit about that? What you think is interesting about the argument and what the argument is?
Yes. Well, ethnicities, I mean, we're talking about 70s, 80s, you know, this period, and there was a lot of discussion about ethnicities, but not ethnicities as such. They used the term ethnic groups. That was the language of the time. But in fact, preceding that, people who came here, Asians, African Caribbean peoples, people of color, you know, they were actually talked about as immigrants. Even their children who were born in Britain were addressed as immigrants. And so the discourse of ethnic groups was actually a little bit of an improvement on immigrants, because of course in the 60s they were indeed immigrants, so it was not a problem. But later on they continued to address these groups and their children as immigrants. And the term ethnic group at least moved away from that definition and talked about ethnic groups as people with a specific culture, with a specific history. So the whole question of history and culture and politics was brought in. But even then, I think there were, I mean, I look back, I used to be at the time part of the ethnic relations unit at Bristol University. And many of the people who were doing anthropology talked about culture and ethnicity. But it was a way of thinking about culture and ethnicity, which tended to have essentialist way of thinking about it. That's what we would call it today. Actually, it was essentialist way of thinking about culture, as if they were somehow inherent to a particular group, as if there could be no change. And the notion of ethnicity actually brought in very much this notion that ethnicity is not essentialist, it's not inherent, but it is socially produced, it's culturally produced. And therefore, we started talking about ethnicity with having socio-political and cultural valence. And I think that's his Hall's kind of, major contribution to make us think about culture as a process, not as something, which is already established there, but actually culture is a process. And through process, obviously, we develop certain kinds of sort of cultural thematics, which become more concrete. But at one level, culture is very much a process.
Okay. So we'll move now on to your work, and particularly on Cartographies of Diaspora, which is your main or most influential publication, I imagine. And this book is really interesting in a way how you kind of bring these kind of key concepts, new concepts about diaspora and diaspora space and cartographies of intersectionality, but you do that in a kind of very biographical sense. You present a living person and your own kind of background of living on 4 different continents. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this impact of migration on your work and how because in some respects you've created some new concepts, you've developed a completely new area of research, which is diaspora studies. But you were also very active politically in that sense that you kind of were involved with the South Hall Black Sisters. As I understand, you were one of the founders. You were also involved with demonstrations against the National Front in the 80s, and kind of also reflecting on Thatcherism. So all of these topics were part of the kind of a cultural center in Birmingham, kind of were important ideas that shaped your work as well. So you should reflect maybe also biographically on that.
Of course. No, it's very true that I was very centrally influenced by the Center for Cultural Studies, but I was also obviously influenced by my own political involvement. I moved from Bristol when I hadn't yet finished my PhD. I was still in the space of finishing my PhD, but my research funding came to an end, and so I needed to find a job. And I looked for academic jobs, but not having finished my PhD, those were difficult to come by. So I actually got a job as a community worker and I moved to South Hall as what I was called actually a youth training officer, but what it was really was community work with young people. And that meant that I actually came to live and work in Southall, which was very influential for me. So for instance, Southall Black Sisters, I was at the same time a feminist, and I was beginning to kind of work together with other women around issues to do with feminism, and particularly around Black feminism. Black, I used term in the political sense, referring to Asian and African descent Black as well. And while I was in Southall, we came together and formed Southall Black Sisters. This was in 1979, when I don't know if you were obviously involved in those issues, but in 1979, Southall was the site of a major political upheaval when the National Front, the fascist National Front, came into Southall, and the local community actually had told the local council not to allow them to come in, because Southall was a predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly Asian area. And they said that it was provocative for the National Front to come into Southall. But the council actually allowed the National Front to come in. So the day the National Front was due to come in, and that was 23rd April 1979, a lot of people, both residents of Southall, but also a lot of supporters, political supporters, trade unionists, members of different kind of parties. A lot of people actually came to Southall, descended on Southall in support of people like us, who were actually protesting against the National Front. And there was a very, very major confrontation between the police and the Black people. And that really meant that I think over 700 people were arrested that evening. And Blair Peach was killed. Blair Peacher was a New Zealander who came to Britain, and he was a teacher in East London. And he had come actually just to support us, really, and lost his life in the process. But he was killed by the police, and it was a very, very awful day, really, that day, politically very important in the history of community organization. But at a personal level, it was a very, very sad day. And from then onwards, after the events of 1979, a number of us, the women, we started getting together and formed Southall Black Sisters as a political organization that looked at not only our position as women, but also looked at questions of immigration, which impacted on people in Southall and in Britain, questions about policing, immigration, and as well as practical things such as, marriages and family life and, those kinds of things. So that was, it was a very, very important period in my life, because I was politically very active. I was also actually, trying to write my thesis at the same time. Then when I finished my thesis, I then moved from Southall. I got the job at Leicester University, and then I moved to Leicester, where we actually started another Black Sisters group, which we called Leicester Black Sisters Group. So my politics continued, but I was working in media studies at the university in Leicester.
Good.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that, Avtar. We talked a little bit about Hall and his sort of shifting intellectual influence, and Hall has obviously been one influence on your work. Who else? Which other writers have you found very helpful in trying to shape your writings? Academic writers or intellectuals?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, obviously, as you said, Stuart Hall was very, very influential. I was actually very influenced by the actual politics of feminism. So a lot of feminists have influenced my work. I mean, people, for instance, like Angela Davis and people like Donna Haraway, and people like, I'm trying to think of other women in fact, Stuart Hall's partner, Catherine Hall, has influenced me. People like Gail Lewis and Phoenix. These are all colleagues and friends whose work has influenced me enormously. But in terms of the overriding influence was that of Stuart Hall, but working together with feminists was itself actually kind of educative and influenced the work that I was doing. Because as I said earlier, my work was always connected with politics, you know, with what was happening on the ground. So while I was actually active in the feminist movement, so to speak, it was influencing what I was thinking and writing as well. And the notion of diaspora too, actually, comes from that wellspring, because I was obviously diasporic myself, having lived in 4 continents. I was a student in the USA. I grew up in Uganda, and obviously had links with India through my family. And then I came to live in Europe. And so in that sense, you know, the concept of diaspora is very real to me. And it's about people who move, are displaced, but also people who create a new space in which they produce new knowledge, new practices, and they contribute to the economy and to politics as well. So in that sense, yes, it's been very central to me, that work with feminists. I want to emphasize that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I can just continue with this in a sense. Obviously, in Cartographies, you discuss extensively diaspora and diaspora space.
Yeah.
And you know, you already mentioned the kind of this intersectionality aspect of it. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. Perhaps, you know, as we mentioned, we talked a little bit before we started about our experiences of being kind of forced to leave a country where you were born. And not ever leaving it on your own terms. And you know, so in a sense, you were made diasporic by others. So there's forced element as well. And then there is a voluntary element present, obviously, in your research and moving to US and, you know, living in different 4 different continents, as you said. So maybe you could reflect a little bit on the kind of the diaspora space and, you know, generally how you come to these concepts.
Yes. Yes, well, diaspora itself is I mean, at one level, it's a historical movement of a group. But diaspora as a concept, I try to present that as an economic, political, and cultural way in which diaspora as a experience is theorized. So it's actually looking at a historical experience of diaspora, of movement, of migration, immigration, migration. There's a whole area of migration studies. But diasporas actually move somewhere and put roots and settle there. Although there's a whole new debate about diasporas, and people are saying that the origins, the question of origins, no matter, I mean, I talk about origins, but I try to make sure that we don't essentialize origins. But the current debate says that origins should not really feature at all in discussions of diaspora, but that's an ongoing kind of debate. But diaspora, yes, it was, I try to think about diaspora in relation to borders. Borders, both in terms of social borders, political borders, economic borders, but also psychic borders. So not just geographical borders, you know, borders in that kind of a sort of a conceptual terrain. And then, of course, I was also thinking about politics of location. That concept also comes from feminism. At one stage, feminists used to talk about politics as if, you were kind of, you belong to the whole world, you were living in the whole world. But then began to think, but no, really, woman is not a homogeneous category, Woman is actually a very heterogeneous category, There are working class women, there are racialized women, there are sexualized women. So the notion of women as a heterogeneous category was very important, came to the fore. And that way, sort of, I started thinking about politics of location was about our locationality along different axes of differentiation. Axes of differentiation such as gender, class, ethnicity, racism, etc. So politics of location is about our location along those axes of differentiation and what ensues out of those which impacts on our lives. So I tried to bring together these three elements, the concept of diaspora, the concept of borders, and the concept of politics of location, and brought it together and thought about it in terms of diaspora space. So diaspora space is a wider concept than diaspora itself. It's actually about, so for example, one can talk about Britain as a diaspora space, where different categories of people jostle with each other, where different class fractions, different genders. So in that sense, it's much more about a whole social formation. The notion, this particular notion of diaspora spaces, about the complexity of the whole social formation of society as a whole, with its heterogeneous political, cultural, and economic kind of spaces.
Thanks very much. Excellent. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Avtar, if we were to move away from cartographies to another very important article that you published in Feminist Review, sorry, entitled "The Scent of Memory." This is a very intriguing and a very, in some ways, in a very exploratory article. You're not saying that you're going to have definitive answers to certain questions that you're posing. It sort of starts with this sort of discussion of Tim Lott's autobiography, where he discusses his mother who lived in Southall and who committed suicide. But then you go on to discuss a number of interviews you undertook in your own work earlier on with women living in Southall, but also their number of school children. And in order to try to understand their sort of their discussions in these interviews and their responses, you draw on Althusser's theory of interpolation, how people are interpolated or they're racialized in certain ways, and they draw on certain discourses of identification. Could you sort of maybe just elaborate on some of, I know it's a very, very complex article and it's very open-ended, but could you just sort of elaborate on some of the issues you do touch on, particularly this sort of this racialization of individuals through discourses, this idea of origins, this notion of memory and identification, but also you try to look at how we can have a different language to try to transcend some of these binaries, which, many of these forms of racism take place within the working class. And you try to think of a different language, which, a very East Asian language, using terms such as Ajnabi, Ghair, and Apna, to try to transcend these differences and have a sense of identification with some of your interviewees.
Yeah, that's a complex one. Yes, yes. Actually, yeah, that article is a way in which I try to look at the lived reality of gender, of race, of ethnicity, and how we actually, from different positionalities, come together or not come together in a way. And it's, as you know, somewhere halfway through the article, I talk about why was I so exercised about this white woman, 54-year-old white woman's situation. Why was I attracted to that? And in a way, it was about both looking at otherness, how otherness is constructed, as well as identification. So you identify with somebody, but there's also otherness that's through racism and especially through gender. Obviously, gender is also a dividing category in terms of male, female, etc. And I was trying to go through different ways of thinking about difference. Actually, I think that's the word. How do we think about difference? Stuart Hall talks a lot about Derrida's notion of difference and the ways in which difference is continually deferred. It's not sort of fixed. And for me, difference, as you may know, well, in cartographies, I actually look at difference myself along 4 axes. Difference understood as experience, difference understood as God, I won't remember now the 4 aspects of difference that I elaborate there. But I look at difference along 4 axes of differentiation. And in that sense, talking about, in this article, scent of memory, I was interested in how was my difference and Jean's difference articulating, what are the racialized projections that we have, or actually realities through which we may or may not connect. I connected with her because to me, she actually represented a lot of women. I had been speaking to Asian women in South Hall who'd migrated from the subcontinent, and they were having memories of their old homes, and they were experiencing the sorts of things that Jean was experiencing as well. So what were the kind of connecting threads across? In a way, it's my struggle with, or continuing to think through, how we can make politics together. How do we identify with other people? How do we overcome things such as racism, homophobia, and different kinds of aspects in social relations which divide us, class relations? How do we actually work across them? And identification is a key thing there. How do we identify, come to, or make ourselves, or create situations in which we come to identify with people rather than de-identify with them? So it's mainly around that area. You can ask me more specific questions, but generally speaking, it was about politics. I mean, I'll talk about, as you said, Urdu words like ajnabi. Making a distinction between ajnabi is a stranger, but a ghair is also a stranger, but he or she also encompasses an otherness with a capital O, really. And therefore, how do we kind of work through ghairness and convert it into ajnabi so that we can actually be different? We don't have to be identical, be different, but yet able to relate to one another as humans. And therefore, ajnabi, ghair, and I don't know, there was a third aspect as well I talked about, which I don't remember now. Apna. Apna is really one's own. So that's it, so for me, the project was how do I actually think of, let's say, white women as my own in that sense? Or how do I think about men as a woman, as our own, rather than as the other? So it's a whole area around otherness, working through otherness and developing a politics of intersection and a politics of belonging together.
Thank you.
Okay, just the last question, maybe something more practical. Since we have a number of students also watching this, what would be the key text that you consider kind of most important that you would recommend to somebody who's starting, to do sociology or social science? What are the kind of texts that have influenced you to some extent and
Yes.
you would recommend to others?
Yes. Well, I looked at that question in terms of thinking about a few things that I put down, 3-4 aspects, which I thought students starting out might actually, concepts really. I thought maybe a couple of concepts that they might want to familiarize themselves with. And then I put together 1 or 2 texts alongside that. Obviously, Stuart Hall's work is central. And David Morley has recently edited 2 volumes of his work. And any students who might want to obviously look up any of his work. And Stuart Hall's work has the merit of being simultaneously complex, but at the same time, being very accessible. And so Stuart Hall's 2 volumes edited by Morley, his work. Then I looked at the term decoloniality. I think students starting out need to actually kind of think through or learn to think through the concept of decoloniality. And I have actually put in, first of all, my forthcoming book, if I may put a plug in for that. It's coming out early next year, in about March next year. And it's called Decolonial Imaginings, Intersectional Conversations and Contestations, And also then I selected Decolonizing Sociology by Ali Meghji. It's an introductory text, so I thought it gives an accessible account of questions of decoloniality. Although there is a new book that has recently come out by Gurminder Bhamra and John Holmeswood called Colonialism and Modern Social Theory. So for more advanced students, 3rd-year students, perhaps that kind of text might be relevant. And then there's a book by Walter Mignolo. I don't know how you pronounce his name, Mignolo or Mignolo, and Catherine Walsh on decoloniality, it's called. That's a useful text. Then I went on to look at intersectionality. I think that's a very important concept that students starting out should actually familiarize themselves with. And here I just picked 1 book text. I mean, there are loads of texts on this, but it's called Intersectionality, and it's by Patricia Hill Collins, who is really the person who's written a lot about intersectionality, and Surma Bilge. So the 2 of them have written this together, Intersectionality. Again, it's actually key concept series, and therefore written in accessible form and a comprehensive treatment of that. Then I looked at the concept of bordering, and I think that bordering should be something that students might need to familiarize themselves with. And so there is 1 book I chose, which is called Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire by Nadine El Inani. And then Bordering, called just Bordering, by Neera Yuval Davis and her colleagues. I thought those would be important. Just 2 more. Then I thought that the area of racial capitalism is important for students to engage with. And there's a book by Gargi Bhattacharya called Rethinking Racial Capitalism. I thought that would be useful. And I also included a book by Floya Anthea Scott, called Translocational Belongings, Intersectional Dilemmas and Social Inequalities. So those are the kinds of texts that I thought might be interesting and useful for the students.
Just, I might ask a question, sort of general, because you've touched a little bit on that. You know, the kind of similarities between 70s and 80s. You know, when reading Stuart Hall and today, and today some of these topics have become really mainstream. They become global. You know, what used to be British phenomenon or American phenomenon has become a global phenomenon in terms of, you know, intersectionality and race and gender and, you know, decolonial. So all of these have. So how would you reflect on you know, kind of something that was to some extent seen as a marginal phenomenon within technology or social sciences has become a mainstream?
Yeah. It's wonderful, actually, because it's great, because it used to be a huge struggle, you know, when I was starting out with my PhD. I got my PhD in 79, that long ago. And, you know, some of these areas were minority areas, you know, they were marginalized. In fact, I think the Center for, at Bristol University, the Center for Ethnic Relations was one of the first centers, academic centers, to give specific, to undertake the specific study of race and ethnic relations. And to be doing work on race was not really seen as kind of the thing to do. You know, you were really kind of on the periphery if you were working on race. You know, you should really be working on class. Even gender was sort of, you know, marginalized at the time. But now, of course, and it's gratifying, really, to think that students are now looking at questions of decoloniality, questions of racism, questions of gender, questions of sexuality, in a connected sort of way. It's great, I think, that that is happening. But I don't think we should actually take anything for granted. I always worry when things change. I always think, will they go back? So I hope that they don't. So I think I'm urging new students who are coming, you know, to make sure that they take on the banner and go forward with expanding the horizon of these different ways of analyzing society.
So we have a question. Steve, will you read from Duty?
Oh, yeah.
There's a very good question from,
Yeah, she says, thank you so much for your reflections, Professor Brah. Thanks for touching on decoloniality and the importance of that. However, given the easy and problematic co-optation of decoloniality by interlocutors of Hindutva in India, brings up a lot of important questions around the decolonial turn in Europe. I was wondering what you would say to that.
I must confess, I'm not familiar with the way in which Hindutva has actually used decoloniality. But my general answer would be, and this applies to other concepts as well, not just decolonial, is that concepts do get hijacked in different kinds of ways. And in academic work, we have to be political animals as well. Politics is about looking at the ways in which different concepts don't get hijacked into problematic directions. So I would say that decoloniality, the ways in which it cannot be co-opted by, for example, Hindutva groups, it's a struggle. I think academic work, intellectual work is a struggle, and we should not shy away from that. So I would say, carry on, continue to interrogate their discourses that Hindutva is putting forward, interrogate them, challenge them, and recreate new spaces in which new thinking can happen.
Okay. Thanks very much. I think we've run out of time now, Siniša, have we?
Yes. I think this is it. Yeah, we are nearly there. Thanks very much. This was very enjoyable, and there will be a recording on YouTube, so people will have opportunity to watch this. And thanks again. You know, I think we've all learned a great deal about things.
Thank you.
So Steve,
I've enjoyed it. It's been wonderful to put faces to names, because I've been actually kind of, you know, these are names, and now we can actually, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Avtar. And hopefully, I don't know, maybe in the future you could come and visit us in Dublin. And
yes, yes. Coronavirus permitting, I would love to.
Especially if you have a new book, which we really look forward to.
That's right.
Yes,
That's
yes,
right. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us, particularly in the middle of summer. It's really nice for you to join us, and we're very pleased to have an audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.